It's been a really amazing morning. Amazing to hear from two young people talk about their experience and how heartfelt that is. And I'm sure those stories resonated with quite a few of you in this room. I I was at all by their comments, but I was even more at all by their vulnerability. And I know that for us who do this work, vulnerability is key. And clearly, for many of us in this room, through the panel discussions that we're having, some of our keynote speakers like Angel yesterday, you could feel and sense that vulnerability and that humility that goes along with this work. The next speaker that I'm about to introduce, who will be our keynote for today, he is an amazing close friend of my family. And by that I mean the kind of person that I allow to welcome into my home. And for many of us in this room, that means a lot, because you just can't invite everybody to your house. And our family have been growing with their family, and really based on our values and how we see the world and how we value people. And I am blessed and honored to call him my friend. And the person that I'm going to introduce is none other than Dr. Franklin Cozy Gay, who is, for those who know him, an individual that is very well accomplished. And I'm not going to have enough time to go through his whole bio, but here's what I want to share. He's currently the Executive Director for Community External Affairs at the UChicago Medicine. That is one of our top Trauma One hospitals here in the city of Chicago. And in fact, that just happened a few years ago. And in fact, lots of credit goes to folks like Franklin and others who make that possible. But I also got a chance to meet Franklin several years ago when he was still a student at U of I, or UIC, where he was doing research around street outreach. And I would tell you that in the beginning, I wasn't really feeling a lot of what he was saying. And in time, as I was also in grad school and learning and being more of a practitioner, I actually realized and learned to appreciate what he was doing and how to leverage that to support my own work on the ground. And that is the power of good research as well, that you use that information to think about how do you strategize in your community. He was also, right before he came to Chicago, which by the way, he's held different positions. Franklin was also the executive director of the Chicago Center for Youth Violence Prevention, which is one of 5 CDC grantees to do and focus on youth violence. He's a person, again, that I totally respect. And while there's so much that I want to say about him, I think that after you hear his presentation and see his slides, you will be just as equal as a fan as I am. Franklin, please join me.
All right, let's give it up to the Mexican Barry White, everybody. Oh, thank you. And I want to make sure I have there we go. All right, great. So first of all, I want to just go back to gratitude that I have for Eddie Bocanegra. Can we give it up to the Bocanegra family, Eddie and Catherine? They've taught me so much in this work connected to humanity, and that is a theme of what I want to talk about today. Being in this space, I'm filled with gratitude. Actually, there's so many of you in this space that inspire me to do the work that I do, that you mentor me as well. So while we're eating lunch, I want us to recognize all the collective strength that we have in this room. Please give it up to yourselves. There we go. So being a part of this conference is incredibly humbling. Particularly 20 years ago, thinking about the work that grew in Chicago, dating back 40 years before that with Irvin Spergel's work, being in the space now actually reminds me of what was happening just 10 years ago. In the city of Chicago in 2013, had pulled funding from a program that many of you guys know that's called Ceasefire. They pulled funding despite showing that there was a 33% reduction in homicides in the West Side community that's known as North Lawndale, and in the South Side community that's Woodlawn. Despite those reductions, it didn't make sense. We're in a different space that we're in now. So I was brought in as a part of a team of researchers that included Dr. Deborah Gorman-Smith and the late great Dr. David Henry. I was brought on as an ethnographer to help do qualitative interviews to try to understand from the client's perspectives, those individuals that were not on their caseload but looked like clients, but also interviewing residents in the community, interviewing parents, interviewing elderly to assess their understanding of this work. With that being said, I want to shout out Jalen Arthur, who was leading this work with Ceasefire at the time, but is now the Director of Strategic Initiatives with Chicago Cred. Let's give it up for Jalen. It was Jalen that connected me with the leaders in those West and South Side communities, including street outreach workers, including violence interventionists. And what I want to do is I want to share a story of an outreach worker about a turning point that I feel is the basis for building a policy focus. It was a community leader who was involved in illegal activity in the community at the time. When I asked him about his liberation story, this is what he shared. I was involved in a shootout with police. I got hit and I lost my sense of awareness for a moment, but I escaped. I gathered myself and I ran. I thought I got away, and so standing in the alley, I was taking a few breaths. And in that moment, I felt the barrel of a gun and the back of my neck. And I heard a female voice. And that female voice said, "Sweetie, put the gun down. Baby, I don't want to shoot." That voice was the voice of an African-American female police officer. Using words like sweetie and baby was giving him the opportunity not only to surrender, but affirming that his humanity mattered, right? It was this incident combined with her defending other colleagues, police officers, from causing him further harm that represented a turning point for him and his involvement in high risk-taking behavior. It was that moment that stayed with him during his incarceration. The fact that she saw humanity in him helped him find humanity in her. The affirmation of individual, family, community dignity, integrity are the tenets of educator and philosopher Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, in which oppression is simply defined as the denial of one's humanity. Humanity is the affirmation of one's right to freedom, justice, dignity, integrity, and love. It pains me to hear policy debates about public safety approaches and the urgency as researchers to explain the impact of community gun violence, when the same urgency does not exist when it comes to explaining the economic toll of policies and practices that have robbed families, communities, and individuals of their humanity and their ability to buffer themselves. Policy must uplift historical harms that create conditions for the present day community violence that we're dealing with. Whoops. I got to figure out this clicker. All right. So luckily, we're not in the space that we were in 2013. I've heard in spaces from the conference so far that we're not in the space that we were 3 years ago. This work has shifted to understand the role of emerging public health that is not simply about focusing on risk and protective factors at the individual level or at the relational level, whether it's your peers or families or at the community level. It's actually going upstream to understand root causes. But what does root causes mean? What is it? How can we understand what that is? So today, many of you, welcome to Chicago. I wish we could have given you better weather. My apologies, right? You'll experience 4 seasons in 1 week in Chicago, all right? So with that being said, what I want to do is give you, some of you may have had Chicago-style hot dog. You might have had Chicago-style pizza. Today, I want to give you a Chicago-style slice of what has happened in this city. When we hear the word civil rights, many of us think about the 1950s and the 1960s. We think specifically about the collective work across different racial groups, youth-led, that was focused on making sure that there were voting rights, but most importantly, interrupting and disrupting discrimination. Seldom do we think about the 12 years between 1865 and 1877, where citizenship and property rights, equal protection under the law, and protection from discrimination in public spaces from the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were actually enforced because federal troops were in the South. However, in 1877, during an election year, just like we're in now, there was a backroom deal that says, hey, I will give you the electoral votes that you need if you take the troops out of the South. This led to the birth of Jim Crow terrorisms. Blacks found out in that space, despite 12 years of being elected political officials, owning land, owning businesses, it didn't matter if you got too close, just don't get too big, right? Men, women, children were lynched, brutalized, dehumanized for actions that dignified their humanity. This terrorism, combined with World War I that ceased immigration from European nations, served as a driving force for the Great Migration. In Chicago, in fact, African Americans were able to get big. In Chicago, we saw the first Black-owned insurance company in the North, Frank Gillespie's Liberty Life Insurance, that's right on 35th and King Drive, the birth of Black newspapers, Robert Abbott's Chicago Defender, the brick and mortar location just around the corner on 34th in Indiana, Anthony Overton's first major conglomerate for an African American that had multiple businesses, including the Chicago Bee newspaper. Any of you, I know we got some New Yorkers in the house. Many of you all know about Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance. Chicago Bee was responsible for naming what was framed as the Black Belt as Bronzeville. But he also had realty companies, life insurance companies. And Jesse Benga had African-American banks, shopping malls, who promoted Blacks working and spending within the community, which would be dubbed as the double duty dollar. Blacks in the North could affirm their right to dignity and humanity. They could get big. However, in the North, we find out that it didn't matter if you got too big, just don't get too close. Between 1917 and 1921, there were 58 house bombings that happened in neighborhoods where Blacks encroached on spaces where whites lived. Ida B. Wells, well, let me pause for a second. How many arrests were there? 0. 0 arrests. Ida B. Wells warned that Chicago was beginning to rival the South. Part of the efforts to restrict movement was the birth of many ethnic European descending gangs. Basically, first and second generation gangs. The birth of gangs was actually a European ethnic phenomenon. It was not a Black and brown phenomenon. Ethnic gangs like the Reagan Coats and the Hamburg Boys. The Hamburg Boys, we had a mayor, Mayor Richard J. Daley, between 1955 and 1975. Richard J. Daley, in his young adulthood, would become the president of this social athletic club that was essentially a gang, right? And so, despite that, want to uplift that during this summer of 1919, Ida B. Wells' op-ed just 20 days before proved to be prescient. It would basically, on July 27th, a 17-year-old boy in 1919, just like Richard J. Daley was a 17-year-old senior in high school, went swimming off a de facto Black beach, right? It wasn't de jure, it wasn't by law. There was no sign that said Blacks only, whites only. You knew, and you knew because of violence. Unfortunately, Eugene Williams And if you've been in Chicago the last couple of days, it gets a little windy here, right? And so coming from 25th Street Beach, started to float in the visible line of whitewaters. Eugene Williams was stoned and drowned. Keep in mind that there had been many house bombings, no arrest. At this point, everyone saw who was responsible for it, but no arrest happened. This activity led to the worst racial incident of violence in Chicago. Then just a little over a week time, 38 individuals were killed, 537 were injured. 2/3 of the individuals that were injured were Black. 2/3 of the individuals that were arrested were what? Black, right? So when we talk about 2020 and we talk about themes connected to no justice, no peace, this goes back over 100 years. Thankfully, in the space we have our building, we're standing on the shoulders of those that have done more with less. Thanks to work that W.E.B. Du Bois was doing related to understanding the Great Migration and how African Americans were living, working, loving in spaces where they were not welcomed, began to serve as an understanding of how do we evaluate and understand social problems as it pertains to race. Charles Johnson, who later was tasked to do an investigation around the root causes connected to the race riots, was able to build off of these learnings, but he also was an African-American man who witnessed and luckily survived the phenomenon that was happening during that time. I'm using this as a proxy or as a bookmark to hold for why we need to have individuals that are close to the phenomenon, leading the work and the research that's connected to it. So, strategies to disconnect African Americans from human rights would move from extra-legal approaches, violence, to now public policies and private practices. The incidents that happened during 1919 were not unique to Chicago. It happened in 24 other cities. 1919, by James Weldon Johnson, anyone that knows Lift Every Voice and Sing, he's the person that provided the lyrics for that. He coined the summer of 1919 as the Red Summer for the blood that was shed. So it was a bad look on northern cities. So what happened? Instead of using violence, what was used are policies and public practices to reinforce the just don't get too close. Restricted covenants were legally binding contracts that specified a house owner could not rent or sell to Black people. Thankfully, there was an African-American man named Carl Hansberry that fought that. He fought it all the way to the Supreme Court. And as a result, in the Woodlawn community that's in the shadows of the University of Chicago, 500 African-American men and women were able to move into communities and not be constrained to low-income areas or areas without resources. Lorraine Hansberry, his daughter, was inspired by her father's experience and wrote a play that would be the first playwright on Broadway called Raisin in the Sun. And in 1961, that after 19 weeks being on Broadway, would be turned into a film with our lead actor, Sidney Poitier, right? So, despite that, urban redlining, despite that restricted covenants were deemed unconstitutional, just like the Matrix, the oppression would recycle, right? Redlining, which was for racially explicit policies at the federal, the state, county, and city governments, where it was unhindered public policy that explicitly segregated metropolitan areas in the United States. Urban renewal programs like the National Highway Act, the Slum Clearance Act, disrupted the very things that help keep neighborhoods safe. It's not the presence of police that help keep neighborhoods safe. It's actually residents' ability to come together, right? To set values and norms that they have for their community. And then to reinforce that through what we describe in sociology as informal social control. Hey, you need to pick up the trash. Hey, no loud music after this time. Many of you know that there are block clubs, right? How we reinforce that ourselves. But when you disrupt community, like Richard J. Daley Here, if you look at this picture, you'll see that the highway explicitly went through the Black neighborhood. And what that does is that it breaks up the opportunity to actually keep your neighborhood safe. Real public safety comes from the people, from the community, which I think has been a theme throughout the conference. Predatory housing contracts. Redlining in itself necessitated that contract sale system for Black homeowners, they were unable to obtain conventional mortgages. So as a result, you created an environment that was ripe for exploitation. Hyperinflated contracts, not able to gain actual protections for mortgages, contributed to a wealth gap of $3 to $4 billion between Black Chicagoans and white Chicagoans. So when we talk about public safety, there's an economic thread that's tied to this, right? Having the resources to make sure that you can actually enhance your own well-being. When that is robbed, it is a systemic problem. As white residents took advantage of low-interest loans to build financial equity, white residents left the city of Chicago. The tax base followed, the jobs followed. The investment in social services decreased, and instead we see a hyperinvestment in policing. Writer, scholar, and cultural organizer Eve Ewing uplifts that every map in Chicago looks the same, whether it's violence, whether it is the COVID death rate, whether it's poverty, whether it's grocery store density. Like the Matrix film, the patterns of disruption and containment continue. Not only was it a 20th century phenomenon, but in the 21st century, the largest destruction of public housing happened in this city. We also had closing of over half of the mental health clinics. Another theme from this is the importance of not only self-care, but mental health wellness. The divestment is real. As a result, school closing, the largest school closing in United States history, happened in this city, right? So when we're talking about public safety, we need to make sure that we're uplifting the policies and practices that actually have weakened communities' ability to be safe. Come on, give it up. All right, thank you. Public policy must account for 100 years of policies and practices that have robbed people of color of their humanity and their ability to leverage resources to serve as buffers against forces that place their health and wellness at risk. We are here today because there has been a reawakening. We are in a new space. I've got to shout out Eddie Bocanegra's better half, Dr. Catherine Bocanegra. Let's give it up. Dr. Catherine Bocanegra reminds us that policies that focus on suppressive approaches only weaken communities. We must invest in individuals and collaborations that foreground those that have been resistant and resilient to structural and interpersonal traumas. I want to uplift the power and my gratitude for CVI work. Paulo Freire, I'm returning to Paulo Freire. He uplifts that liberation must come from within. We have heard many stories in many different panels, including the young panelists before us, on how they were able to liberate themselves. Paulo Freire says that when you attempt to liberate yourself by harming others, you are submerged in a state of sub-oppression. It's very important for us to uplift that oppression is not simply interpersonal, but it's also structural. However, what's important through that is outreach workers' ability. And I'm using psychological empowerment theory here, right? Which is real simple. What do I possess that will allow me to hook you, to allow me to say, I can trust you, right? The cultural capital of recognizing I can trust you because you are asking me to make changes that you've made yourself because you lived the life that I've lived. The human capital, it's also connected to, you know what, you're a good person, you looked out for me. I really appreciated the young sister that was talking about, hey, I've got money, here, I'm gonna take care of you. People remember that human capital, right? And so part of empowerment theory is having an opportunity to connect. There's no greater work than CVI in that ability to connect, because you have lived and survived, been resilient and resistant to the oppressive forces that are not only interpersonal, but also structural. With that, the second component of that, sorry, I'm like, I can't see stuff this close, and then I gotta take my glasses off. All right, the other part of that is the feeling component. And with that is, when I witness you bringing two ops together, or rivals, right? And I witness you, who may have a name in the streets because of the harm that you caused, that now you're not causing harm, but you're actually bringing people together. It increases a feeling component of empowerment, self-efficacy, that if you could do it, I can do it. And man, when I experience, man, how am I in this space, got a job with somebody that's an op, and I'm not being harmed? So now I'm experiencing it, and what it does is it gives me a feeling. Again, Paulo Freire says that the liberation must come from within, but it is the hooks from CVI workers that allow that to happen, and it's that feeling, that's that transformation that's incredibly important. The last component of that, thank you. Sorry, I can't see. All right. The last component of that is the doing, right? It is CVI's consistent presence. The brother from Newark in the panel talked about no one's ever off our caseload, that flexibility, right? Understanding that sometimes people are gonna fall back, right? But understanding that you need to have that consistency, that doing, that accessibility and flexibility to support that state of liberation. I'm here representing the work that I advocate that was inspired by CVI. I have the gratitude to advocate for a hospital-based violence intervention program on the South Side, but it would be remiss for me not to admit the level of complicity that the University of Chicago had in restricted covenants, right? In urban renewal programs, but in the 21st century, also not having a level 1 trauma center on the historic South Side of Chicago, right? In 1988, they pulled out of that network. On August 15th, 2010, Damian Turner, an 18-year-old African-American male, was a victim of a stray bullet that was less than 4 blocks from the University of Chicago Medical Center. There was no trauma center, so Damian had to be transported 10 miles away to the north side. And you're in this community, you're in the Streeterville community, which is just, this hotel is in the shadows of that level 1 trauma center. Unfortunately, Damian died. Community stakeholders were well aware of the cruel irony that Damian was a youth community organizer, protesting Chicago's 21st century style of structural violence, such as the demolition of public housing, school closings, and mental health clinic closings. Thanks to community activism, leaders, elected officials, our Community Advisory Council for the Urban Health Initiative, Dr. Selwyn Rogers and his team, on May 1st, we celebrate 6 years of operating a level 1 trauma center. Thank you. But here's the dopest part. Dr. Rogers said, hey, I'll be the chief for trauma, but not without a hospital-based violence intervention program, right? And so that's how our program was able to be established. I want to shout out Mark Ortman, who was actually one of the original hospital-based responders and case managers. Thank you, Mark. My leader, Senior Vice President Brenda Battle, secured the philanthropic and university support to fund the program that I've had the privilege to lead over the past 3 years. And I know Eddie's like, all right, brother, wrap it up. Our orientation is not to simply look at interpersonal risks, but also understand that structural and interpersonal violence is something that needs to be addressed at the same time, not this or that. Also, that true recovery is not simply hospital-based. There has to be a collaboration and coordination and leading with CVI partners. I just wanted to show my team. Thanks to the work that CVI has been doing, we've been able to sit at many city tables that are connected to how we're responding to violence. Also, thanks to this work, we can't afford to be competitors. I'm very proud that we work with another level 1 trauma center around a collaboration that's called Southland Rise. And it really focuses on how we can bring resources that are not only tertiary after someone's been harmed, but how can we also invest in primary prevention. One thing that I want to uplift is that I want you to think about these questions that are here. How can we also make sure that we're continuing to promote an infrastructure for prevention and intervention, but also making sure that we're addressing these root causes, right? We have to understand that that divestment policies and practices have impacted our city, and until we begin to uplift that, we won't really get true healing. Part of what I'm inspired by is the work of Darity and Mullins that really uplifts that the path towards closure or healing is actually acknowledgement. We have to first begin with acknowledging the harms of the past. I'm very proud that the work that we've done with survivors of violence that are using glass blowing as a form of therapy, we have been selected by the Chicago Monuments Project to actually install art for 38 locations where individuals were killed during the 1919 race riots. So we're tying this story, thank you. We are tying the story of structural racism with those that are surviving today. As I begin to close, I want to uplift that one thing that moves me again, walking out of the Equal Justice Initiative, is that we stand on the shoulders of those that have done more with less. I often refer to that quote when I'm feeling conflicted, when I'm feeling defeated, to remind me of the history of those that have done more with less. And as we discuss public policies, we need to make sure that Black and brown scholars are at the forefront of these contributions, because like W.E.B. Du Bois stated, we cannot be cool, calm, objective, detached scientists while Negroes are being lynched, murdered, and starved. All right? Come on. So with that being said, I want to shout out the Black and Brown Gun Violence Prevention Collective, our co-chairs, Shawnee Buggs and Joe Richardson, our executive director, Jocelyn Fontaine, some of our speakers that have been here, like Dr. Tanya Sharp, Dr. Chris St. Ville, and then also one of our leaders for Community Violence Intervention Leadership Academy, Dr. Chico Tillman. It is important to really uplift this liberation capital, that it's about narrative change. It's about who is actually being close to the phenomenon. The work that we do has to be relevant to, reflective of, and accountable to, and protective of, and proximate to the communities impacted by the structural violence as well as interpersonal trauma. This work is not solely academic-led, it's insurgent. We rely on our front line to help drive the research questions, to help drive the research solutions and strategies. With that being said, I'm gonna close out. I'm very proud to be a Chicagoan. I'm proud that Ida B. Wells decided that she was gonna live most of her life in the city of Chicago. Ida B. Wells reminds us that when it comes to true healing, we need to acknowledge, let the light of truth actually help us understand where we are right now. Our policy focus needs to focus on a light of truth. We must begin with acknowledging the harms of the past, strategies around redress before we have closure. Thank you very much.